This show may contain adult language and themes. Listener discretion is advised. With that out of the way, let's start the show. You're listening to the Murder Is My Sign podcast, the true crime astrology podcast. I'm your host, Jordy Death, here to light your way through the true crime astrology storm. And welcome to part 2 of Killer Couple Bonnie and Clyde. In part 1, we went back in time 100 years to lay the scene for what was going on in America and introduced Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. If you haven't already listened to it, be sure to go back and check out part 1. Now that everyone is sufficiently caught up, let's continue. It's January 1930. Clyde had just walked into the kitchen where Bonnie was making some hot cocoa. They were over at a mutual friend's house when the two had met, and it was love at first sight. The two talked late into the night. Clyde had confided in Bonnie and told her that he was on the run with his friends, wanted for holdups in Waco and MacLeod counties. Bonnie hung on to every word, and Clyde recounted his stories. He went so far as to tell Bonnie that she could come with them on their next job if she didn't believe him, and see his crew in action. Bonnie accepted the offer readily, and Clyde was happy to have a good-looking gal like Bonnie to hang on his arm and admire him. It's been said that Bonnie offered to drive the getaway car for the Barrow gang. However, before the gang had a chance to make a name for itself, Clyde got arrested and was held in the Waco County Courthouse. According to the Deadly Duo book by Paul Rowland, Bonnie had managed to smuggle in a gun to Clyde during visiting hours, to which Clyde and his cellmate Frank Turner disarmed the guard on duty at gunpoint and locked him into the cell, which gave them the opportunity to escape. In April of 1932, Bonnie had her brush with the law when she was caught after a failed hardware store robbery and spent a few months in jail before being released because the grand jury failed to indict her. On the Wikipedia page for Bonnie and Clyde, it said that Clyde was the getaway driver during the store robbery, which left the owner, J.N. Butcher, dead, having been shot to death. This happened on April 30th, 1932. Granted, the Deadly Duo book I use isn't super in-depth, but this was not mentioned in the book. So, between the two sources, kind of sift through the stuff, and I know that there are a lot of more in-depth books and sources. Unfortunately, I just don't, if I didn't have to work an 8-hour job pretty much every day, I probably would have the time to actually read them. Alas, I don't. At least not yet. Anywho, while she was in jail, Bonnie spent her time writing poetry. During my research, I found 3 poems that Bonnie had written: The Trail's End, Suicide Sal, and The Street Girl, which are all, honestly, not that bad. I would like to read to you the poem entitled Trail's End, which tells the story of Bonnie and Clyde from her perspective. It's long, so bear with me, and knowing that they're Texans, I'm going to forewarn you that I'm probably going to slip into a southern accent, but I think it's worth it. The Trail's End by Bonnie Parker. You've read the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you're still in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow gang. I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal, and those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There's a lot of untruth to these write-ups. They're not as ruthless as that. Their nature is raw. They hate all the law, the stool pigeons, spotters, and rats. They call them cold-blooded killers. They say they are heartless and mean. But I say this with pride, that I once knew Clyde when he was honest, upright, and clean. But the law fooled around, kept taking him down, and locking him up in a cell, till he said to me, I'll never be free, so I'll meet a few of them in hell. The road was so dimly lighted, there was no highway signs to guide, but they made up their minds. If all roads were blind, they wouldn't give up till they died. The road gets dimmer and dimmer, sometimes you can hardly see, but it's fight man to man and do all you can. for they know they can never be free. From heartbreak some people have suffered, from weariness some people have died, but take it all in all, our troubles are small, till we get like Bonnie and Clyde. If a policeman is killed in Dallas, and they have no clue or guide, if they can't find a fiend, they just wipe their slate clean and hang it on Bonnie and Clyde. There's 2 crimes committed in America, not according to the borrowed mob. They had no hand in the kidnap demand, nor the Kansas City depot job. A newsboy once said to his buddy, I wish old Clyde would get jumped. In these awful hard times, we'd make a few dimes if 5 or 6 cops would get bumped. The police haven't got the report yet, but Clyde called me up today. He said, don't start any fights. We aren't working nights. We're joining the NRA. From Irving to West Dallas Viaduct is known as the Great Divide, where the women are kin and the men are men, and they won't stool on Bonnie and Clyde. If they try to act like citizens and rent them a nice little flat, about the 3rd night, they're invited to fight by a subgun's rat-a-tat-tat. They don't think they're too smart or desperate. They know that the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. Someday they'll go down together. They'll bury them side by side. To few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's a death for Bonnie and Clyde. What a great poem, right? I mean, I'm actually fairly impressed. I mean, she was like maybe 18, 19 when she wrote that. And the foreshadowing is pretty crazy. I mean, but like she says, when you go around breaking the law, there is really only one way it will ever end, especially in the 1930s. Because at this point in time, and we'll kind of sort of get into this in the 3rd episode, there is no Federal Bureau of Investigation. There is no federal government that oversees the capture of criminals. At this point in time, it was always left to the state jurisdictions. But we'll get more into that in the 3rd episode when we introduce a pretty cool character. Or a man, I should say, because he was very much a real person. So, anywho, within a few weeks of her release, Bonnie was reunited with Clyde. The two had a decent run of evading police capture as they enjoyed a period where they robbed fruit stands, gas stations, and train depots. However, they were soon arrested after a witness noted their license plate on their stolen car and called it into the police. That was a lesson that proved to be valuable to Clyde, for he always made sure to change the license plates immediately after each job. In August of 1932, the Barrow gang were in Springtown, Oklahoma, when they happened upon a countryside dance. The gang had been drinking illegal liquor and stumbled into the dance, clearly inebriated. A couple of local cops accosted them, demanding to know why they were drunk in public. Clyde and gang member Raymond Hamilton took out their guns and fired. One officer was shot in the gut and wounded, the other was shot in the throat and died almost immediately. A buddy of Raymond, Everett Milligan, was with the group that night, and in the chaos and confusion of the gunshots, ran off, but was soon captured by a group of locals who held him until the police could arrive and arrest him. He was held for questioning, and when asked who the shooters were, he said it was the Barrow gang. An all-state alert went out saying to bring them in dead or alive. By the time the alert was issued, Bonnie and Clyde were already on their way heading for the state line, with Raymond riding in the back seat. Bonnie mentioned that they should head to New Mexico where her Aunt Nettie lived. It was so far from the shooting in Oklahoma that no one would think to look for them there. So Clyde, with his lead foot, stepped on it, driving to New Mexico. When they got to New Mexico, though, Clyde's lead foot caught the attention of a local patrolman, Joe Johns, who noticed the out-of-state plates and radioed the number in. Which is kind of weird to think that in the 1930s, the radio was already in cars. I mean, it wasn't very great, and, these cars weren't that great nor safe, but it still kind of blows my mind that was, almost 100 years ago. Anyhow, so Officer Johns radioed in the number of the plates, and when it came back, it was that the car was hot, as in stolen, and he decided to follow it to the home of Bonnie's Aunt Nettie Stamps. Clyde disarmed the officer and pushed him into the waiting car. Officer Johns was missing for several days, presumed murdered by the Barrow gang, but much to everyone's relief, he turned up, alive and unharmed. He told the local papers of his wild and crazy story of how the Barrow gang kidnapped him and was forced to take photos with Bonnie and Clyde. It was pretty astounding that Officer Johns was not outright killed by Clyde, who seemed to have a hair-trigger temper and would shoot anyone who dared look at him the wrong way or make a snide remark. Howard Hill, a store owner in Sherman, Texas, made the fatal mistake of making a sarcastic remark to Clyde while handing over his money from the register and was shot dead. The gang had killed others who had gotten in their way, making the Barrow gang public enemies. As notorious as they were becoming, they were utter failures, though, in their lawless profession. By the winter of 1932, the pair realized that they would never obtain the wealth that they wanted by robbing tills from stores. They needed big money, and in order to get that, they would need to rob a bank. The gang chose the Oswego Bank in Carthage, Missouri. Bonnie cased the joint, memorizing the layout. However, when it came to the time to actually commit the robbery, Clyde rolled in, pulled out his .38 in full view of a guard, who then in turn began firing his gun. Clyde ran out with only a few dollar bills that he had been able to steal from the teller. The next job had Clyde running, guns ablazing, into a bank that had closed down years before. Not a single person was inside, and all the tills were covered with dust and cobwebs. Well, I guess when you're young and dumb and you decide to break the law, these things tend to happen. Around Christmas time in 1932, the couple grew homesick and decided to head home to Dallas, where they met with their families in secret locations. It was then that 16-year-old W.D. Jones had pestered Clyde into letting him join the gang. Although he was only 16, W.D. could drive a car and handle himself in a fight, which Clyde believed would make him an asset to the gang. On Christmas Day, the three drove around town of Temple, where W.D. spotted a brand new Ford V8 coupe. He had bragged about being able to steal it and that it would be able to outrun any patrol car. But when he got into the driver's seat, he could not start it. Clyde was getting fed up and told Bonnie to take the wheel of their own car while he pushed W.D. to the side and tried to get the now flooded engine to start. The commotion of the sputtering car brought the attention of the owner, who raced out into the street. He grabbed Clyde by the tie as the car kicked into life, and the car accelerated as Clyde stepped on the gas. A gun went off, and the owner of the vehicle released his hold, falling to the ground, dying. Early January of 1933 had the Barrow gang shooting their way out of an ambush set by police that was actually set for a different criminal. In the shootout, Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis was shot and killed. By March of that year, Clyde's brother Buck had been released from Huntsville, and the two reunited. The brothers decided to rent a furnished apartment above a double garage in the family-friendly Freeman Park area in Joplin. The area promised privacy and anonymity, but curious neighbors would end up ruining the party for the Barrow gang. It didn't take long before local residents reported seeing men carrying armsfuls of weapons into the building, and that the curtains were drawn day and night. Police took the reports seriously and had the building under surveillance. The gang grew restless being cooped up in that flat. They decided to rob the local bank because no one knew them around there, and the apartment would be the perfect place to come back and hide out. No one had any idea that the police were already watching, waiting for them to fuck up. And fuck up they did. The gang had robbed the bank, and the police were able to match the descriptions of the fleeing suspects to that of Bonnie, Buck, and Clyde. So on the morning of April 13th, the police blocked the garage doors with one of their cars and surrounded the building. The cops weren't that quiet about it either, and the gang was quickly alerted to the police presence. A gun battle began with such ferocity that the cops didn't have time to run for cover. Two fell and died almost immediately. As the gunfight continued, Clyde realized that they had to make their escape because to stay inside would be suicide. so he ordered everyone down into the garage, where they all piled into their Ford. Clyde drove right through the garage doors, brushing aside the police car. He stopped just long enough so Buck could grab his new wife, Blanche, who was having a case of the hysterics, and ran outside during the gunfight. The police were utterly stunned at what had happened, but now they knew who the two new gang members were because Blanche had left her purse behind, and the police found Buck's parole papers. The police had also found several rolls of undeveloped film, along with the arsenal of guns that the gang had stowed away. When the film was developed, it had some of the most infamous pictures of what we think of when we think of Bonnie and Clyde, such as Bonnie posing with a gun and cigar in her mouth, and one of Bonnie with a shotgun reaching for her pistol in Clyde's waistband. The gang found their way down to Ruston, Louisiana. Clyde ordered WD to steal a black Chevrolet that had caught his eye, but in true WD fashion, he fucked up royally. WD took so long to get the car into gear that the owner, H. Darby Dillard, was able to borrow his girlfriend's car and take off after his stolen one, with his girlfriend, Sophie Stone, along for the ride. I mean, it was the 1930s, there wasn't much for entertainment back then. When WD met at the rendezvous point, Darby leapt out and confronted him, only to be surprised by the shit-eating grin on his face when he took out his gun and the Barrow gang walked up behind him. Buck, Bonnie, Clyde, and Blanche. Darby and Sophie were now hostages of the Barrow gang, but the atmosphere lightened some when the gang offered to buy them hamburgers and promised to drop them off safely once Clyde got sick of driving the new Chevy. The group conversed about all the things they had in common, but when they asked what Dillard did for a living, the gang dumped him and Sophie off at the side of the road with a couple of bucks so they could get back to town. Darby Dillard, it turned out, was a mortician. A bit of foreshadowing, perhaps. Well, it was a miracle that no one was killed the night that Clyde was driving down Highway 203 towards Wellington. He had failed to see warning signs that the bridge ahead was out, and when they came upon it, it was far too late to stop. The car braked hard, skidded, flipped into a ravine, throwing everyone out of the vehicle. Everyone else was more or less fine, except Bonnie, who has sustained third-degree burns on her right leg. Sources are unsure if the burns were due to gasoline fire or from acid from the car battery that was under the floorboards. But if I had to guess, it was probably either a mixture of both or more so the acid. And when you think of an acid burn, and a third-degree burn is like almost like down to the bone, it really makes me nauseous. It's just to deal with that, especially in 1930, when medicine was still pretty shoddy at best. Jesus, crazy. Regardless, though, Bonnie was in very bad shape. A helpful farmer, though, came upon them and carried Bonnie back to his farm, where his wife tended to the wound as best as she could. Clyde put WD on the lookout in case any police came that way, but he fucked up yet again when the farmer left to go to a neighbor's house to phone the police. Clyde chewed his ass out and the gang took off before the cops could arrive. Clyde knew that they had to get Bonnie to a doctor, which was risky for the gang. When they pulled into a small tourist town in Arkansas, Clyde called up a doctor who believed the story that he told him about Bonnie being injured by an exploding oil stove. The doctor did the best he could, but told Clyde that she should be taken to a hospital, which was obviously a no-go when you're a criminal wanted for murder in a bunch of states and also for robbing banks. Instead, Clyde hired a nurse to attend to Bonnie. The nurse, though, would have to be paid from another bank robbing job, so Clyde sent WD and Buck off to Alma, where they had to rob a bank. When they returned, they had good news and bad news. The good news was that they got the money. The bad news? They ended up killing a United States Marshal at the grocery store they had also held up, and they were now all truly and royally fucked. So off they went, stealing another car. This one just so happened to have been owned by a doctor who had conveniently left his medical bag inside. The gang's luck, though, was about to run out. On July 18th, 1933, the gang came upon Platte City, Missouri. Bonnie was more or less unable to walk without help, usually by Clyde carrying her. The gang found themselves surrounded by dozens of heavily armed officers, and much like the Freeman Park shootout on the garage that their getaway car was parked in was also blocked, but this time by an armored truck. And just like last time, Clyde drove through the garage door and rammed through the armored truck, just barely squeezing by. WD shot up the truck, wounding the officer so that he could not follow them. Even though the gang was able to escape, it was at a great cost. Blanche was blinded in one eye due to the glass shards. WD had been hit in the shoulder, and Buck had been shot in the head. But surprisingly enough, he did not die right away. The bullet that hit Buck had blown a large hole into his forehead, which exposed his brain. Yet he remained semi-conscious, and even talked and ate some food. The wound, though, was so severe that Clyde and WD dug him a grave. The police were on the trail, though, and the Barrow gang soon came under fire yet again. Bonnie, Clyde, and JD managed to escape on foot, but Buck and Blanche were not so lucky. Buck was shot in the back and taken to the hospital, where he died 5 days later, and Blanche was taken into custody. The gang was on the run once more, and by September risked another run to Dallas to see their families for the first time in 4 months. This is where WD parted ways and continued on to Houston, where his mother had moved to, and was eventually arrested without incident on November 16th, and returned to Dallas. Clyde continued to rob stores with a small-time help, while his family helped take care of Bonnie and her very bad, very fucked up leg, which basically had curled in on itself from the muscles tightening. On November 22nd, Bonnie and Clyde narrowly escaped arrest while trying to meet with some family members around Sowers, Texas. Clyde drove up on the family car and sensed that a trap had been set, so he drove straight on by, which caused Dallas Sheriff Smoot Schmid and his deputies to stand up and open fire upon their vehicle. No one was seriously hurt in the crossfire, surprisingly, but a bullet did pass through the car of Bonnie and Clyde, striking them both in the legs. Time was not on their side, though. You can only run for so long. The only running we're doing here, though, is out of time. So this is where we will stop in this week's installment of Killer Couple, Bonnie and Clyde. Tune in next week as we conclude the series with Bonnie and Clyde's final run and get into their star charts and their compatibility. If you like what you're hearing and you want to support the show, you can join the Death Heads over at the Boneyard by becoming a patron at patreon.com/murderismysign. Just like Michelle, Jake, Jessica, Crystal, and Holly. Thank you guys so much for your combined support of Murder is My Sign. It really is appreciated. You can also help by sharing the show with anyone you can, any way that you can. Murder is My Sign can be found on all major podcasting platforms, such as iTunes, Google, Spotify, Amazon, and Spreaker. You can also download the show using your favorite podcasting app. If you'd like to connect with me on social media, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all at Jordy Death. That's JORDY Death. Or you can email the show directly at murderismysignpodcast@gmail.com. Next week, we shall conclude the Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde. But until then, take care of yourself and each other, and rest in peace.